There he is. Get him. Don't let the boy escape. I remember the sound of their voices more clearly than anything else. The shouting, the laughter, and the dogs. Because that was the moment I understood something no 14-year-old boy should ever have to understand. They were not chasing me to bring me back, they were hunting me. My name is Abel. In the summer of 1879, I was 14 years old, thin as a fence rail, and fast enough to outrun most boys my age. That night, my speed was the only thing standing between me and a group of powerful men who had decided my life would be their entertainment. The land outside the small Texas settlement of Dry Creek stretched for miles under a brutal sun. Dusty plains, scattered cedar trees, rocky hills that rose like broken teeth from the earth. By 1879 the Civil War had been over for more than a decade. People liked to say freedom had come. But in places like Dry Creek, freedom mostly meant the chains had disappeared while the power stayed exactly the same. The largest ranch in the region belonged to a man named Colonel Beauregard Voss. Most people just called him the Colonel. Tall, broad-shouldered, gray beard trimmed neatly along his jaw. He spoke slowly, confidently, like a man who believed the entire world should listen when he opened his mouth. And most of the time, people did. The newspapers in Austin praised him as a war hero and businessman, but the people who lived near his ranch knew a different man. They knew his temper. They knew his cruelty. And they knew about the strange entertainments he arranged when wealthy friends came to visit. I had lived on the edges of that world my entire life. My mother, Ruth, had once been enslaved on that land before the war ended. When freedom came, she stayed, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The slave quarters became worker cabins, the chains disappeared. But the work stayed the same. Long days, little pay. And the constant understanding that angering the wrong man could still ruin your life. Most days I hauled water buckets, fed horses, and ran errands across the enormous Boss Ranch. I worked hard. I spoke little. And I learned early that the safest place for a boy like me was somewhere no one important was looking. But I watched everything. The way the ranch hands talked when the overseer wasn't around. The way wealthy visitors arrived in polished carriages from Austin. And the way Colonel Voss's mood could change the entire ranch in a single moment. Some days he rode across the fields laughing loudly, tossing coins to workers like he was some generous king. Other days, he walked the grounds in silence, and grown men stepped aside to avoid meeting his eyes. Those were the days everyone tried to disappear. I first noticed him watching me near the horse stables late one afternoon. The sun was low in the sky. Everything glowed orange and dusty. I was carrying a bucket of water toward the trough when I felt something strange. That feeling you get when someone is staring at you. I looked up. Colonel Voss stood by the fence with two men from the city, expensive coats, clean boots, the kind of men who never worked a day in the Texas heat. And all three of them were looking directly at me. Not angry, not curious. Something else. Something that made my stomach tighten. The colonel leaned toward one of the men and said something quietly. They both laughed. I lowered my head and walked away quickly, but even as I crossed the yard, I could still feel their eyes following me. That night whispers spread across the worker cabins. Colonel Voss was hosting another gathering. Wealthy men were arriving from Austin and San Antonio. The ranch kitchen stayed busy long after dark. Servants carrying trays of food, crates of imported whiskey. Music drifting from the big house. But the older workers looked nervous. They remembered things, stories from earlier gatherings. Stories no one repeated too loudly. Strange games, cruel competitions.
I sat outside our cabin beside my mother, while the sun disappeared behind the hills. She listened quietly to the whispers moving through the camp. Then she looked at me. Her voice was softer than usual. "Stay close tomorrow. Don't go near the big house." I nodded. I didn't fully understand the fear in her voice. The next afternoon the visitors began arriving. Carriages rolled through the ranch gates one after another. Men stepped out laughing, carrying rifles and bottles of whiskey. The ranch felt different. Heavier. Like the air itself knew something bad was coming. I spent the day running errands between the kitchen and the stables, trying to stay invisible. But just as the sun began to set, a messenger appeared at the edge of the worker cabins. "The colonel wants the boy." Several heads turned. "Which boy?" someone asked. The messenger lifted his hand and pointed. At me. The world around the cabins went silent. My mother stood slowly. "For what?" she asked. The messenger shrugged. "Colonel didn't say." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, but refusing wasn't an option. So I followed him. Across the yard, toward the big house. Lanterns glowed in the courtyard. A dozen wealthy men stood around drinking and laughing. Several held rifles. Colonel Voss turned when he saw me. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well now, there he is." The men looked me up and down, like they were inspecting a horse. 14 years old, the colonel announced. "Fast runner too, from what I hear." One of the men laughed. "What's the game tonight, Colonel?" Voss lifted his whiskey glass, and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Gentlemen, tonight we hunt something different." The courtyard fell silent. Then the colonel pointed directly at me. "We hunt the boy." For a moment, I thought I had heard him wrong. Men around the courtyard laughed, not loud, not comfortable. The kind of laughter people use when they're not sure if something is a joke. But Colonel Voss was not laughing. He stepped down from the porch slowly, boots scraping against the wooden boards, his glass still in his hand. "Here's how it works." He walked in a slow circle around me, like a man inspecting livestock. "We give the boy a head start. 10 minutes. He runs into the woods past the North Ridge." One of the visitors frowned. "You're serious?" Voss stopped behind me, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Completely." He leaned closer. "Run fast, boy. It makes the sport more exciting." My heart started pounding so hard I thought everyone in the courtyard could hear it. A hunt, for me. The men began lifting rifles from a wooden rack beside the porch, metal clicking, lanterns being lit, dogs barking somewhere behind the stables. One of the visitors shifted uneasily. "Governor, this seems a bit extreme." Colonel Voss turned his head slowly. "You've hunted deer before, haven't you?" "Well, yes." "Then tonight you hunt something smarter." A few of the men laughed again, but the sound carried something different now, something darker. The colonel pulled a gold pocket watch from his vest. He checked the time, then snapped it shut. 10 minutes. A hand shoved me forward, hard. "Run." For half a second I couldn't move. My legs felt frozen, my mind struggling to understand what was happening. Then the dogs barked again, loud, hungry. And instinct took over. I ran, across the open field, through tall grass brushing against my legs, past the fence line where the ranch land ended and the forest began. I didn't look back, not once. Behind me the voices grew louder, men shouting, lanterns clinking, the dogs straining against their chains. I crossed the last stretch of open ground and plunged into the trees. The forest swallowed me immediately. Branches clawed at my shirt, roots twisted under my boots. But I kept running, because somewhere behind me, men with rifles were waiting for those 10 minutes to end. Back at the ranch courtyard, Colonel Voss leaned against the railing again, watching the dark tree line where I had disappeared. His guests finished their drinks. Servants moved nervously between them, refilling glasses. 10 minutes should give the boy a fair chance. One of the men wiped sweat from his neck. "You really think you'll make it far?" Voss smiled faintly. "Let's find out." He opened the pocket watch again. The lantern light glinted off the gold casing. The second hand moved slowly. Tick, tick, tick. Deep in the forest, I ran until my chest burned. Branches snapped under my feet. I ducked beneath low limbs and slid down a rocky slope into a dry creek bed. Only then did I stop, just for a second. My ears strained for sound. At first, there was nothing, only wind moving through the trees. Then, far behind me, a whistle cut through the night. Back at the ranch house, the colonel snapped his watch closed. "Time's up." The men lifted their rifles, handlers released the hunting dogs, and Colonel Beauregard Voss stepped down from the porch stairs. "Gentlemen, let the hunt begin."
The first sound I heard after that was the dogs. Not barking wildly, not yet, just the low, eager growl of animals that knew a trail had begun. Then the barking came. Sharp, excited, hungry. My heart nearly stopped. They had brought dogs. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. Running alone might not be enough. I forced myself to think. My mother had once told me something while we were tracking a stray goat through the woods. Water hides scent. The memory hit me like a spark in the darkness. I looked down at the dry creek bed beneath my feet. It twisted through the forest like a pale ribbon under the moonlight. I started running again, but not across it, along it. My boots splashed through shallow puddles left from recent rain. Cold water soaked into my socks. But I kept moving, step after step, faster. After what felt like forever, I climbed out of the creek bed and pushed uphill through a wall of thick brush. Thorns scraped my arms. Branches snagged my shirt, but I forced my way through. Behind me the barking grew louder, then quieter, then confused. Maybe the creek had worked. Maybe. Back near the edge of the woods, Colonel Voss's hunting party had reached the place where I had entered the forest. Lanterns swung through the darkness. Dogs sniffed the ground eagerly. He ran straight into the trees. One of the handlers pointed toward the forest. "Smart boy." Colonel Voss studied the ground calmly. Then he smiled slightly. "Let's see how smart." The dogs suddenly lunged forward, their noses low, following the trail. The hunters moved behind them, boots crunching over leaves, lantern light flickering between the trees. Deeper in the forest, I reached the top of a narrow ridge. Tall grass brushed against my legs. Cedar trees stood scattered along the slope. My lungs burned. My chest felt like it might tear open. For the first time since the hunt began, doubt crept into my mind. Could I really outrun them? Men with rifles, horses, dogs. Then I thought about my mother.
about the look on her face when the messenger called my name. And suddenly something inside me hardened. If I stopped running, I would never see her again. So I kept moving, down the far side of the ridge, into thicker forest. The trees grew taller here, older, branches so thick they blocked most of the moonlight. I followed the faint sound of running water, and soon a narrow stream appeared between moss-covered rocks. Without hesitation, I stepped into the water. Cold, so cold it made my teeth clench, but I welcomed it. I began walking downstream, carefully, slowly, trying not to splash. Minutes passed, maybe more. I had no way of knowing. Finally I climbed out near a cluster of large boulders at the base of a hill. The forest here felt different, quieter, heavier. I leaned against one of the rocks and tried to slow my breathing. For the first time since the hunt began, the dogs sounded farther away. Maybe the stream had worked. Maybe I had lost them. But then, a gunshot exploded somewhere far behind me. Bang! Then another. The hunters were spreading out, firing into the woods, trying to flush me out. Fear surged through me again. This wasn't just a chase. It was a trap. Back in another section of the forest, Colonel Voss rode slowly along a narrow trail with two of his companions. One of the dogs barked loudly near a fallen log before circling in confusion. The handler frowned. Lost the scent here. Voss studied the ground. Then he looked toward the direction of the stream. The boy's clever. He lifted his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the hills. Far away on the rocky slope, I flinched. The echo rolled through the forest like thunder. They were still coming. Closer. Smarter. More determined than I had hoped. But what I didn't realize yet was that the woods around me were not as empty as I believed. Hidden deep among the trees were people who had been watching Colonel Voss's ranch for years. People who knew about his cruel games. And when they saw a terrified boy running through the forest with dogs on his trail, they began moving through the woods as well. Quietly, carefully, because before the night ended, the hunters were going to learn something they had never expected. In these hills, they were not the only ones capable of hunting. I stayed behind the boulder for a long moment, trying to slow my breathing, trying to listen. The forest had grown quiet again, too quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the careless crashing of men on horseback, not the heavy stomping of hunters pushing through brush. These steps were careful, slow. Like someone who knew the woods. My body tensed instantly. I crouched lower behind the rock, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped. Then a shadow moved between the trees just a few yards away. For a moment I thought about running again, but something about the movement felt different. Whoever it was, they were trying not to be seen. Then a voice came from the darkness. "Boy." I froze. "Come out slow," the voice said. "We ain't with them." I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, carefully, I leaned around the edge of the boulder. Moonlight slipped between the branches above, and I saw him, a man standing a few steps away, older, maybe 40. Worn hat pulled low over his eyes. A rifle resting across his shoulder. Two other figures stood behind him in the shadows, watching quietly. The man studied me for a moment. Then he nodded slightly. "You the one Colonel Voss turned loose tonight?" I swallowed, then nodded. The man let out a slow breath. "Thought so." He motioned for me to step closer. "Name's Isaiah." I moved toward him carefully, still unsure if this was some kind of trick. But Isaiah lowered his rifle slightly. A quiet sign he meant no harm. "We've been watching that ranch a long time," he said.
Heard the dogs earlier. Figured the colonel started one of his games again. My voice came out weak. They're hunting me. Isaiah's face darkened. Yeah, he said quietly. We know. The two men behind him stepped forward now. One was broad-shouldered with a thick beard, the other looked barely older than me. Maybe 17. Both carried rifles. But neither of them pointed their weapons at me. The bearded man nodded once. Caleb. Then he pointed toward the younger one. That's Thomas. Thomas looked at me with something like sympathy. You run far? He asked. I tried, I said. Isaiah glanced toward the distant barking of dogs. The sound was closer now, moving through the trees. You did better than most. The words made my stomach tighten. Most? I asked. Isaiah didn't answer immediately. For a moment he just stared into the darkness. Then he spoke quietly. You ain't the first boy Voss turned loose in these woods. A cold weight settled in my chest. Other boys? I asked. Isaiah nodded once. Yeah. I hesitated. Then forced the question out. Did they get away? Isaiah looked at me for a long moment. Then he answered. Some did. Most didn't. Silence fell over the group. The distant barking of the dogs cut through the trees again, closer now. Fear rushed back into my chest. Stronger than before. This wasn't just one cruel night. This had been happening for years. Isaiah suddenly gestured toward the darker woods behind them. You can't stay here, he said, dogs might catch your scent again. Caleb nodded. There's an old logging trail east of here. Leads deeper into the hills. Hard place for horses. I looked back toward the direction I had come from. The barking was getting louder. The hunters were closing in. Why are you helping me? I asked. Isaiah gave a quiet, humorless laugh. Because someone should have helped the others. Without another word he turned and started moving through the forest. Caleb and Thomas followed. After a moment, I followed too. We moved quickly through the trees. Stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches. Climbing over fallen logs. Crossing uneven ground. I struggled to keep up. My legs were shaking from exhaustion. After several minutes Thomas dropped back beside me. You from the ranch? He asked quietly. I nodded.
There. Thomas glanced ahead toward Isaiah before speaking again. My parents used to. Before they left. I looked at him. Left. Thomas nodded. A few years ago, after Voss's men beat my father near to death. Bitterness filled his voice, far older than his years. Some folks around here don't trust the colonel much. Ahead of us Isaiah suddenly raised a hand. Everyone froze instantly. We listened. Then we heard it. Horses, moving through the brush behind us. Lantern light flickered faintly between the trees. Caleb cursed under his breath. They're spreading out. Isaiah nodded slowly. Smart hunters. Fear crawled up my spine. If the riders circled ahead of us, there would be nowhere left to run. Isaiah scanned the terrain quickly, then pointed toward a narrow path winding downhill through thick cedar trees. This way. We started moving again, faster now, because somewhere behind us, the hunt was getting closer. The barking of the dogs grew louder behind us, closer, hungry. Isaiah moved faster now, pushing through the cedar trees as the narrow trail twisted down the hillside. Loose stones rolled beneath our feet. Branches scratched across our arms. But none of us slowed down. Because we could all hear the same thing. The hunters were closing in. After several minutes, the trees suddenly thinned. The trail opened onto a narrow ridge of rock. Beyond it, dark hills stretched endlessly under the fading moonlight. Isaiah stopped, turned toward me, listened carefully. He pointed toward a faint trail winding deeper into the hills. That path leads to the old mining camp, abandoned years ago.
Caleb checked the chamber of his rifle. "Horses can't move easy up there," he said. "Too many rocks." Isaiah looked back toward the forest behind us. The lantern lights were beginning to appear between the trees. Moving closer, they're spreading out. My chest tightened. "What about you?" I asked. Isaiah gave a small shrug. "We slow them down." I stared at him. "You can't fight them." Caleb let out a short breath. "We ain't planning to win. Just delay them." Thomas stepped forward and gripped my shoulder. His voice was quiet. "Just keep running." For a moment I couldn't move. These men barely knew me, and yet they were about to risk their lives for my escape. Isaiah noticed the hesitation in my eyes. "Boy, if you stay here, then everything we did tonight was for nothing." Behind us a dog howled, much closer now. Lantern light flickered between the trees. "There. I see movement." Isaiah grabbed my shoulder and turned me toward the trail. "Run." My legs finally moved. I ran along the narrow path into the hills, the rocky ground tearing at my boots, the wind rushing in my ears. Behind me I heard the sharp crack of a rifle. Then another. Voices shouting, dogs barking wildly. Isaiah and the others had begun their part. I kept running. Across jagged stone ridges, through narrow paths between tall rock walls, until the sounds of the hunters began to fade behind me. Finally the trail curved around a cluster of boulders, and suddenly, the land opened before me. A wide canyon stretched into the distance, covered in tall grass, scattered trees, and the faint silver ribbon of a stream winding across the valley floor. The first light of dawn was rising along the horizon. I stumbled down the slope and reached the stream, falling to my knees beside the water. My reflection stared back at me, a thin boy, dirty, exhausted, eyes older than they had been the night before. For the first time since the hunt began, the world around me was quiet. No dogs, no shouting, no rifles, only wind and water. But even in that silence, I couldn't stop thinking about the people who had helped me. Isaiah, Caleb, Thomas, and the man who had shown me the ravine path, Samuel. Each of them had risked their lives to give me a chance. And because of them, I was still alive. I stood slowly and looked back toward the distant hills. Somewhere beyond those ridges, Colonel Beauregard Voss and his hunters would soon realize the truth. Their prey had escaped. The boy they had chased for sport had vanished into the Texas wilderness. And the cruel game they started that night would become a story whispered across the region for years. Because sometimes, history is not written by the powerful men who believe they control everything. Sometimes, history is written by the ones who refuse to stop running, even when the whole world is chasing them.